One of the biggest problems for corn farmers for decades now has been corn rootworms. And what you're going to find with corn rootworms is there's the larvae, that worm stage early in the season, and then you have adult corn rootworm beetles later in the season. That's the adult stage.
We're mainly concerned with that larvae stage. That's the big thing that we have to work on right now. Now, beetles, you're going to need a foliar spray. You can spray them when you see them.
If you can kill the bug, the worms right now, then we're not going to have any adults later on.
Well, that's true. You're not going to have very many coming from your field, but they can move from field to field.
Yep.
So right now what you can control is what's in your field. And you can control these larvae that are out there. So basically last year's adult beetles laid eggs in your field. Now, it may even have been 2 years ago that the adults laid eggs in your field. There may be something called extended diapause where they don't hatch the first year, they'll hatch 2 years later. Either way, you have eggs in the ground in your cornfield. They're going to hatch as soon as corn roots start growing. It's going to trigger those eggs to hatch. The larvae are going to crawl towards your corn roots and they're going to feed on them. The only way you can treat for them is to either use a traded corn product, like a Smart Stacks corn, for example, or using some sort of insecticide at planting time.
So let's talk first about that BT trait. There are many different BT traits out there that will control rootworms, or at least we think they're going to control rootworms. The problem is, over the last few years, we've seen some of these rootworms becoming resistant to certain BT traits. Now, to this point, we haven't found any rootworms that are resistant to multiple traits. In other words, they aren't resistant to the Herculex and the Yield Guard trait, but some of them have been found to be resistant to Herculex, some resistant to Yield Guard, some resistant to other BTs that are out there. So what we encourage you to do if you're having that resistance problem is simply plant a two-traded corn.
Well, there are several different two-traded corns now on the market with Smart Stacks, with Duracade. There's a number of things that are being developed too that are going to help with this, where we're getting more combinations just to try to avoid resistance issues out in your field, because you plant that single trait rootworm product, you just don't know if there are going to be some rootworms in your field that are resistant or not. Obviously, if you've seen resistance before, you know it's a problem. But for many farmers, they say, no, I don't know if I have a resistance issue or not. The safest bet is to plant that stacked product. Now, the other thing that you can do, in addition to planting a stacked traded hybrid, is you can use a corn rootworm insecticide. And insecticide use has grown dramatically in our country over the past few years.
Here's the thing, though, too. A lot of farmers are saying, well, if I'm worried about this resistance, and like in our area where we farm, we have to use insecticide because we are having resistance issues with BT rootworm traits. So if a farmer says, well, I just don't think I'm going to use that traded product at all, I don't want to spend the extra money to go with a Smart Stacks or Duracade, I think I'll just use an insecticide, you can certainly do that. But let's just think back. Why did farmers want to go with the traits? The reason why is because we could get 99.9% control, or even, I'll go so far as to say 100% control with the best insecticides out there. I mean, we're talking Force, AZTEC, those types of products, 90% control, maybe 95 at best. Okay, that's it. And those are the best ones. So yeah, it's no big deal if you got 10 rootworms out in your field, but what if you have 1,000,000 rootworms out in your field? You don't want to have those kind of issues, so that's why we encourage you, consider still using a trait, just switch over to a double stack trait if you've got resistance issues in your area, and then in addition to that, to help protect the trait, use an insecticide.
It's kind of like weed control when you look at bug control. We're putting something out pre-emerge, we're putting it out very early, right at planting time, any of these insecticides that we're using, and we're trying to control a bug that's really not going to be a problem for a few more weeks, or maybe even a month or more, depending on how early you're planting and when the temperatures are going to warm up and the rootworms are going to start developing in your soils. So it's kind of like controlling late season pigweeds. We can do a great job with pre-emerge herbicides, but you know, there's still going to be a few escapes that pop up later.
Yeah,
That's
but
why
I don't worry about that at all, because with late season pigweed, we're talking 3 months down the road. With rootworms, you're talking a month, maybe at the very most 6 weeks. And let's face it, the only reason why the rootworms aren't hatching earlier is because we don't have enough heat. Well, if we don't have enough heat, then how is my insecticide going to break down? So I don't worry about that one bit, not one bit at all.
I'm just explaining why these insecticides aren't perfect. I think if we were putting them out the
reason
day
why
that
they're
the bugs are going to be there, it would probably be a little different story.
See, I disagree. I say the reason why these products aren't perfect is they just don't have the efficacy. They don't have the proper placement. We're not maybe using enough of that out there.
Well, okay, let's talk about that placement now. When we're thinking about putting insecticides out, there are some, like Fortress, for example, that have to be right in in the furrow. There are others like Force or AZTEC that you could put either in a band on top of the ground. You could do a T-band where there's a band on top of the ground and some in furrow, or you could drop them all in furrow if you want. There's really 3 different ways you could do this. And when we're talking about that, let's just say that you put all your insecticide in furrow, as many guys like to do. Where's your root system going to be? Well, it's going to grow out from that furrow. And with these insecticides,
it's going to be above the seed.
Yeah, they're going to protect a certain zone right around that seed, but your nodal roots are going to grow above that, and then they're going to stretch out beyond that. And that is a big reason why we aren't getting 100% control with them. Whereas the trait, that Bt protein, is going to be all throughout that root system, and we're going to do a nice job controlling bugs, hopefully. If they
well,
don't
when
have
I come back
resistance.
to that efficacy thing, I guess what I'm talking about is the idea for the rootworm is it's going to take a bite out of the root. So if it's a Bt, then it has to ingest that protein. Whereas it doesn't have to go bite into the insecticide, it has to come in contact with the insecticide, and we only have a few little granules out there. There's no guarantee that it's going to hit that.
For me, where I'm planting some corn on corn, in a contiguous corn situation, you need both for sure. I am planting a Smart Stacks corn, so I've got 2 traits, 2 Bt rootworm traits in the hybrid, and also I'm using a full rate of insecticide out there because I'm concerned about resistance possibly being an issue for me, and I want to make sure I don't have any kind of bug issues at all because that just devastates my root system, which ultimately devastates my yields.
Here's the other thing that I want you to consider. There is no rescue for rootworms. I get calls every summer, guys say, oh, I didn't control my rootworms early, now I need to rescue it. Well, good luck. There's just nothing that works very well. You can try a high rate of liquid Lorsban, hope for lots of rain, and maybe at best get 50% control. I mean, there's just nothing that we can do later on. That's why you've got to be thinking about this right now when you put that corn in the ground.
Well, it's going to take a pretty good shot to get rootworms under control, and it's also going to take a pretty good shot to get our weed of the week under control. We'll show you how to stop this tough weed later in the show.